How do you transition from reading Pinyin to reading characters? Are compelling texts better than comprehensible texts? And which tools should you use when reading Chinese? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to answer some reader and listener questions about reading in Chinese. And I have selected these questions because there is a reading challenge this month, and it starts on November 10th and lasts until the end of the month. And the goal is to help you improve by reading more than you normally do, and if you want, also partake in some friendly competition. To learn more about the challenge, head over to the article linked to in the show notes or go to challenges.hackingchinese.com. And that is true even if you listen to this in the future, because if you go to the challenge site, you will be able to see what challenge is on when you are listening. But this time the focus is on reading, and I do think that reading is the second most important skill, or the second most important thing you should be doing with your time if you want to build your Chinese proficiency. And the most important thing is, as regular listeners will know, listening. And maybe it's a little bit weird to talk about things being more or less important. It's not the case that if you have a certain amount of time available and you can choose between reading and listening is always better, or indeed reading is always better. It's just that listening is so much easier to combine with other things you're doing, so you can fit much more listening into your day. And that means that listening as a whole should make up a much bigger part of your study routine than reading should. It follows then that if you can choose between the two, you should definitely choose reading, because you simply have fewer opportunities to do that, so do it whenever you can. And this challenge is a good opportunity to try to read more than you normally do. And it's always a little bit tricky to set goals for challenges like these, and I normally recommend students to do more than you normally do. That is a little bit vague. For example, if you are reading nothing at all, how much should you read this challenge? And if you are already reading quite a lot, how much should you increase? And this then also depends on how much time you are studying Chinese overall. If you're a full-time student, you can definitely read for hours every day. But if you're working full-time and doing other things, maybe even something like 20 minutes per day on average will be quite challenging. But I would say if you haven't tried at all, at least make it a substantial increase. Maybe 50%, maybe try to read twice as much as you do normally. And if you have already pushed yourself quite hard in this direction, just add a little bit depending on what other things you are committed to doing during the challenge. To give some more specific numbers, I think anybody could go for 10 to 20 minutes per day. That's not too challenging. But if you're studying full-time, you can of course go for much more than this, up to several hours per day. This is a good illustration of the difference between reading and listening, because in the previous listening challenge, I was able to listen for more than 100 hours in a challenge, and that's 3 weeks. And that is simply not possible to do with reading. If I were to read 5 hours per day, I would have to basically quit my job or just stop doing a lot of things I'm doing. Whereas 5 hours of listening per day is possible to do without changing too many other things in your life, as long as you plan ahead and have good habits in place. But for listening, this simply doesn't work. So go for something that is realistic, more than you do now, and something that feels a little bit challenging, but not impossible. The article on Hacking Chinese contains lots of advice for what to read and how to read, and I will also put some of this in the description of this episode so you can access it easily. And next week, as the challenge starts, I will also republish an updated version of my best free Chinese reading resources for all levels, and that will contain even more things you can read. If you have any recommendations, whether you are a beginner, intermediate, or advanced students, please let me know. I'm always eager to learn about new and good resources for improving Chinese reading ability. So in the rest of this episode, I'm going to answer 3 questions about reading in Chinese. And if you have any questions about learning Chinese you would like me to address in one of these Q&As, do send me an email at editor@hackingchinese.com or leave a comment on Hacking Chinese. So today we have 3 questions that I hinted at in the introduction. And the first question is about comprehensibility versus interest. So should you focus on something that you find interesting even if it's too hard, or should you stick to something which is much easier even if you find it less interesting? The second question is about pinyin versus characters, how you transition from being used to having pinyin to reading actual texts in Chinese that don't have pinyin. And then finally, the third question is about reading tools. And yes, we can say that Pinyin is a reading tool maybe, but this is more about practical tools, digital tools, and apps and so on that you might want to use when reading and what that means for your learning. So let's kick things off with the first question, which is from Adam. And as usual, I'm going to paraphrase the original question, summarize it a bit, and make it a little bit more general so it applies to not only the person who asked the question, but this topic in general. So what Adam wants me to clarify here is the seeming conflict between texts being comprehensible, as in there being easy, and them being interesting, because I usually recommend students to focus on texts that are comprehensible, where you can understand as much as possible, ideally something like 95% or more, so you get into this extensive reading where you can cover a lot of text. But this is not easy, because not all of these texts are terribly compelling and interesting. So it seems then that there is a conflict here, because I also recommend students to focus on listening and reading things you really like and you really want to know more about. And so if these texts are much harder and you can't get into this extensive reading mode with these texts, should you then choose the easier, more boring text, or should you stick to the difficult ones that you find really interesting? So one thing I think is worth clarifying here that I hadn't really thought about that much myself before considering this question is that when it comes to being interested, thinking something is fun, compelling, or just thinking in general that learning Chinese is worthwhile, that is something very subjective that can come from a lot of different sources. So for example, I can read a text that I find very interesting. I want to know what happens. I want to know the information or learn the information in this text. But I can also enjoy a text for other reasons. Maybe I'm reading it in a context that makes reading interesting. Maybe it's in a class with a great teacher and we have awesome discussions about the text, and that's what makes me want to read it. Or it's something else. I simply enjoy learning Chinese and reading text and feeling that I can make sense of these characters in context is rewarding enough that I think that maybe the text itself doesn't matter that much, and I'm okay with reading something that maybe wouldn't be very interesting if it were written in my native language. So I bring this up because motivation and feeling that you want to learn and finding engaging and interesting ways of learning is very important, because that will determine how much you study. If you don't like what you're doing, you're going to do it less, and so it is by that very fact a worse method for learning. A good method needs to be not only efficient or effective, as in it teaches you what you want to learn in a reasonable amount of time, it also needs to be interesting enough that you actually use it, because if you don't use the method, you are not going to learn anything, and so the rest doesn't matter. I'm bringing this up here because I think it is important to find ways of learning that you find interesting, but I don't necessarily think that everything you read and listen to in Chinese needs to be compelling in itself. Of course, if you can get both, it goes without saying that you should read something which is both comprehensible and compelling. But like I said, this is rarely the case, and indeed, if you are a beginner or intermediate learner, I can think of almost no content that is genuinely compelling. Yes, fine, graded readers are more compelling, and the best graded readers are a bit compelling, but compared to something I would actually call compelling in my native language or in English, even the best graded readers are at best moderately interesting. This is a problem I have spent time trying to address over at WordSwing, where I've written several text games that you can play, and they might not be engaging because the texts are brilliant or very interesting in themselves, but because they are also interactive and you get to choose what you do and how these stories develop, maybe that makes it more interesting in itself. So it's not just about the characters, how difficult the vocabulary is, and so on. So the bottom line here is that yes, you need to make sure that how you study is interesting, but I do think that comprehensibility in many cases trumps this, and it's simply not a good idea to only focus on things you find interesting, even though they are super hard. So if we compare two students, one of which is willing to, say, spend a lot of time doing graded readers and reading easier texts, and someone who's only willing to read things they genuinely enjoy, even though it requires heavy use of a dictionary and the texts are actually way too hard, I think the first student is going to be much better off. It's going to be more enjoyable in itself because, like I said, enjoyability here is not only tied to how compelling the text itself is, because no text is terribly interesting if you need to spend, 80% of your time with your nose in a dictionary. And even if you have access to a pop-up dictionary, I simply don't see a case for spending lots of time with interesting but very difficult texts. Now, this doesn't mean you should never do this. I think you should spend most of your time with comprehensible input, and this goes for both reading and listening. And extensive reading and listening then is what you want the most, and I'll put links to this in the description. And we also talked about this in episode 16. Then by all means, you can also read texts that are quite difficult, but about topics that you really thoroughly enjoy, and this can make all the rest of your reading feel more worthwhile because you're building up a reading ability that you can then use to read things you enjoy more. Maybe you can think of this as the dessert. You first have to eat your vegetables and the main course, and that would be comprehensible input then. But if you want to top this up with some difficult reading about something interesting, by all means do so. Just don't flip the proportions around so you spend almost all your time with difficult texts. And before we move on to the next question, I want to point out the obvious. The worst thing you can do is to spend all your time on texts that are neither compelling nor comprehensible. And this is in fact what many students do, and this is not your fault if you're doing this, probably, it's usually your teacher. Because if you are spending all your reading time in your textbook, every single text is going to be, well, at best moderately interesting, and it's going to be very difficult because textbooks like throwing in a lot of new vocabulary and grammar, so this does not count as extensive reading. So make sure you read beyond your textbook, and for ideas about how to do this, there are plenty of links in the article on Hacking Chinese, and again, check the show notes. So let's move on to question number 2, which is from Susan, and it is about reading Pinyin versus reading characters. And this experience is rather common for students, so you start reading and you focus mainly on Pinyin, but then at some point you realize that now I got to start reading Chinese characters, not Pinyin. Either it's because your textbook suddenly removes Pinyin from book 3 or something like that, or it's because you encountered Chinese in the real world where there isn't any Pinyin. So let's talk about Pinyin a little bit and how to transition from Pinyin to characters. So Pinyin is a bridge between the spoken language and the written language, or the other way around, you can walk this bridge in both directions. And as I discussed in episode 38, Pinyin is not the same as pronunciation, so if you think that they are indeed the same thing, you should definitely check out that episode. But then it's also true that Pinyin is not the writing system, because Chinese is written with Chinese characters, and Pinyin is actually only used in educational settings or for very specific reasons, such as when you want to, say, mark how a very difficult character is read aloud or something like that. People do not communicate in Pinyin, even though it is of course true that Pinyin is the most common input method when you type on a phone or a computer. But still, the text that results and that people actually read is characters, not Pinyin. For students coming from languages that also use the Latin alphabet, as Pinyin does, the problem is that we tend to automatically look at the familiar letters if they are there. So if you have a typical, textbook dialogue where you have characters and then above the characters you have Pinyin, students are invariably going to look at the Pinyin before they look at the characters. And this is deeply ingrained. It is very difficult to deliberately only look at the characters, and you will find your eyes focusing on the Pinyin instead, because those letters have followed you since you were a child, and they are so friendly and so familiar, and the Chinese characters are so scary, especially if there are many of them. So this is an interesting example of where a certain support system can make it harder to learn something rather than easier. You could think of Pinyin here as training wheels, and if you want to learn to bike, it's very nice to have training wheels in the beginning because you don't fall over all the time and you can get some basic familiarity, what it's like to be on a bike and so on. But if you actually want to learn to ride a bike, you have to take the training wheels off, because they are in effect keeping you from practicing the skills you need, that is, to maintain your balance. And when you ride a normal bike, you don't have the training wheels. And so this is similar for reading Chinese. The goal is, of course, to be able to read without Pinyin, But if you always have Pinyin, you are not going to practice the skills you need to read, i.e. you are not going to look at the characters. So it would seem then that the simplest and maybe best solution is to get rid of Pinyin and just start reading characters. And this will be slow and effortful at first, but as you gain familiarity with the characters, because now you're actually trying to decipher and read the characters instead of just looking at the Pinyin, you will be able to learn to read Chinese. Still, having access to Pinyin can be very useful. It helps you bridge that gap, so if you know how to say something, you can then realize how it is written, or if you know how to write something, you can then also figure out how it is spoken. But if you have access to this information all the time, you are not going to develop the skills you need to read Chinese. So what I think is the best solution is not to just get rid of Pinyin in, say, all textbooks or learning materials in general. Instead, it is to introduce a certain cost to looking something up. And it doesn't have to be a high cost. If it's too high, it gets really annoying because as a student, you maybe don't know what something means. You want to be able to look it up or you want to be able to do something with it. And just having the character then is not very nice. On the other hand, if it's too easy, say if you put the Pinyin right above the characters, we know that students simply don't look at the characters and then it's too easy. So you want to find a sweet spot between these two extremes. And there are several ways of doing this. So for example, textbook authors often put the Pinyin on a different page. So you have the Pinyin, but at least you need to flip a few pages and maybe find the right spot and then you can see the Pinyin. That is reasonably easy to access, but still doesn't allow you to skip reading the characters altogether. Well, of course, you could just stay in the Pinyin section and ignore the characters, but I think if you have listened to me this far, you realize that you do have to read the characters. So I think this is a good way of doing it. When it comes to digital reading, there are also many tools and resources you can use. For example, you can have a pop-up dictionary where you point at a character and you can see how it is read, but the text itself does not have Pinyin. This is preferable, I think, to annotating a text and adding Pinyin to everything, because at least now you have to point to a character. And yes, theoretically, you can then slide your cursor along the text and just read the Pinyin anyway, but I think you are an intelligent student and you realize that reading the characters is what you should focus on, so try to use this tool, but not all the time. This is a great segue to the third and final question, which is about tools for reading. So, for example, pop-up dictionaries. This question is very short and to the point, and it's simply which tools I recommend using when reading Chinese. I already mentioned reading digitally versus reading printed text, and in general, I think the case for reading digital text is very strong, and this is partly because there are many convenient tools you can use. Before I go into that, let's talk a little bit about printed texts, because I think those can be great. And for example, if you have a graded reader that you know is on an appropriate level, then having a printed version can actually be great, because this will teach you some things that reading digitally might not. And this is related to the cost I mentioned earlier. So if you have a pop-up dictionary every time you read and you can click or tap on any character and just instantly know what it means, this doesn't allow you to practice some skills you need to read texts when you don't have access to this tool. And I already mentioned the problem of not looking at the characters here, but this could be extended to many other areas. So for example, one important reading strategy to develop is to be able to figure out the meaning of an unknown character or unknown word based on context. And if you always give yourself the right answer without ever trying to guess based on context, you will not develop this skill. But if you read on paper, where it might be slightly more annoying to look something up, you might have to think, okay, what does this character mean? Okay, maybe it is a noun because it's in this part of the sentence, and I know they are talking about this, so maybe it's a tree of some kind, or maybe it's a fruit. And then maybe you can look it up, but maybe you don't have to, because being a little bit tolerant to this type of ambiguity is actually correlated with higher proficiency. So being okay with not understanding everything and being able to move on and interpret a text anyway is an important skill to have. And I do think that reading printed texts fosters this type of thinking more than reading a digital text where you always have access to your favorite tools. That being said, I think digital reading has huge benefits, especially if you are trying to read something which isn't right on your level, where you already know 98% of the words, for example. And to be honest, for most of us, when we try to read something online or something compelling, as we talked about earlier in this episode, it is going to contain difficult language, and then being able to look that up and get the gist of what something means and just move on instead of spending 5 minutes in a dictionary is very useful. Another advantage of digital reading is that as long as you have a smartphone with you, you can technically have access to a full library of books in Chinese and you will never run out of things to read. Whereas it would be prohibitively expensive and impractical to have that library at home, and lugging around heavy books just in case you want to read something is much less convenient than simply bringing your smartphone. For an overview about the impact of digital reading on learning Chinese, David Moser wrote an excellent guest post about this on Hacking Chinese a few years ago, and I'll put the link in the description. So let's actually answer Michelle's question here and recommend some tools that you might want to use when reading. And I've already mentioned pop-up dictionaries. And I don't have a clear favorite here. I happen to use one called Para Chinese Pop-up Dictionary, but there are others and they do basically the same thing. You can also get a similar effect in Pleco by using the clip reader. So this takes your clipboard, so if you say copy a text in Chinese, you can then read that text in Pleco with access to the dictionary entries by simply tapping the characters. You can also purchase an add-on that allows you to do this with documents, not just your clipboard, and you can also buy graded readers inside of Pleco and then use this interface to read them. Considering what I said earlier about training wheels, I think it's a good idea to be a little bit cautious about using tools too much. So when you want to practice reading Chinese, the best thing is to just read. And that means reading characters without pinyin and without any other kind of support. And this requires the text to be at a decent level, of course. And while this then isn't a recommendation of a tool, I still think you should check out my article about the best free Chinese reading resources, because then you can pick something to read where you don't actually need to use any tools. And that, I think, is actually the best kind of reading. Remember that the difficulty here is not only determined by the text itself, it's also about what other kinds of support already exists. So this is not necessarily about a tool as such, but if you choose to read something that also has pictures, so for example, if you are reading the subtitles of a movie, or if you're reading manga or something like that, you do have the images and you do have the text, and so the images can help you interpret what the text means. Maybe we will soon have AI tools that can dynamically generate a, say, graphic novel based on a text, but I don't think we're there quite yet, so this is more about choosing the right reading content rather than using a tool to making it more comprehensible. Another category of tools that I think can be useful are annotators that add certain information to a text. And we just talked about Pinyin and why it's not necessarily a good idea to always add Pinyin. But for example, adding only the tone marks can sometimes be useful if that's what you want to focus on when reading aloud. And it might also be convenient to be able to generate a word list, say. And so there are many tools that do this, and I'll make sure to put links to these in the description. In fact, if you want to make reading and listening easier by using various tools, you should check out an article called 8 Great Ways to Scaffold Your Chinese Learning, and of course I'll also link to that in the show notes. So these then were 3 questions and answers about reading in Chinese to kick off the reading challenge that starts on November 10th. Joining the challenge is completely free, and I hope to see you there. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.